Hi, now what we're going to do, I'm just going to give you a little update here. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 are examining women and men's group and the individuals that have influenced the cultural view of gender and sex over time. So how we see the experience of what is feminine and what is masculine has changed a lot in some ways and not in others. Now, in addition, we're going to review each gender, more current, historical, and overall influencing goals of each one. So of the two broad groups of the men's group, which is where we're going to start with the men's group, this is not to put men first. It's just in terms of the way that I've outlined it, I've started with the men's group. Now, they've been less involved than women in the movements to change images of their gender. Women's groups have been much more active and have a longer history, often because they're not generally, that is, men's groups aren't generally the targets of gender discrimination or disadvantage the way that women have been. Like women's movements, men's groups are constantly evolving with new groups arising around every corner. No single agenda or viewpoint exists underlying or unifying all men's groups. Some men's groups work to provide new images of masculinity and are aligned with feminist organizations, liberal branches in particular. Other groups work to safeguard and increase men's privilege and reject feminism. So it goes on quite a range, a gambit. Masculinity has been an increasing and popular area of study since the 1980s. Men have been both in support of and in opposition to women's movements. And their movements have often begun in response to the women's movements. So let's get a start looking at the men's efforts to define masculinity and what it is to be a man. And we're going to start first with the pro-feminists, pro-feminist men's groups. They're also called progressive men or male feminists. This movement began in the 1960s as men faced the sexism presented in the new left social movement with groups like the CNCC, which was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the CDS, Students for the Democratic Society. Now these, and I should say, these took place in the United States, and a lot of the reflection of gender had some roots in the United States, but there were parallels in Canada. Now, some men ignored these issues. Now, when I say the new left, it was like issues around the time where women were expressing discrimination and violence against women by men. And so some men's groups sort of ignored this issue, while others saw the merit and supported the liberal feminist idea of egalitarianism. Now, for those of you who may not be aware, egalitarianism is sort of a balance between men and women and the roles that they play within society. Now, it's argued, and we'll bring this up in both this group and in the women's group, that you could argue quite easily that the perspective in society today is more patriarchy. Men favored overall in society and the roles that they play, and women not. And then there are examples, very few, mind you, in the world where the distribution is more matriarchal, female-driven. But egalitarianism is a balance. And so these men's groups that emerged in support of the anti-violence movements of the 60s, supporting liberal feminism, egalitarianism, others embraced the redefinition of masculinity. Today, most male feminists support ending men's violence. They support rights for the LGBTQ people, men's greater involvement with family, and working with social justice issues. Now, some pro-feminist men perform what's known as the traitorous identity. Now, this is when a man who is a member of a group challenges particular attitudes or actions that may be common and accepted among members of that group. And for example, and I've done this, and maybe you have as well, is, maybe you're among your friends of men, and a sexist joke is expressed. You might just go along and smile, or you may find it funny, but in a traitorous role, this is where you bring it up. You talk about it among your groups of male friends. And surprisingly, when I've done this, more men support having me brought it up than I would have imagined. It's not something that everybody finds very easy to do among their male friends, because there's a certain vibrato or perspective that generally gets accepted by men. But when we start talking about it, we find not all men do accept that. So the goal of a traitorous identity: criticize the commonly held and accepted attitudes and actions. Engage in personal persuasion. There's nothing wrong with having dialogues about things and to be able to learn and grow and be a better version of ourselves. Pro-feminists want to develop the emotional capabilities that society discourages in men. They're forced to repress emotions. I've had this dialogue with many people around how they've raised children and how they raise their daughters and their sons differently. And one of those differences are girls are often promoted or supported in having emotional expression, where boys and men are oftentimes discouraged. So by encouraging men to be more sensitive, caring, and open, and able to engage in meaningful relationships with others. I've seen this personally in my own life. And again, I would challenge you to sort of reflect on your own. As my father aged, and he was later in his life, this would be in his, he retired when he was just before he was 60. He's 86 now. So just after his retirement, that was at about 57, 58, he reached out and connected in a more meaningful way with his children and his grandchildren. It was almost like it had become okay, or it was the societal pressure to sort of be a man had been relieved, and permission was given to engage and care more deeply about people in his life and his family, and he did, and he has now. I think there's been a shift where more men feel like they can be emotional and not be viewed as weak. So now let's look at some of the organizations and the movements supporting anti-violence and the pro-feminist view. These are not the only men's groups. This is just one collection. The first we'll look at is what's known as the National Organization for Men Against Sexism, known as NOMAS, N-O-M-A-S. And it's a male feminist organization that sponsors workshops, speakers, and annual conferences to increase men's awareness of options for emotional expression, ending men's violence, developing pro-feminist studies, and supporting education against homophobia. Now that's a huge shift in what men have typically been advocating at this point in time. Remember, we're back in the 60s. This is not, today. There's four main issues that NOMA was supporting: recognizing and resisting masculine power and privilege, so that's that egalitarian support away from patriarchy; ending violence against women. Their argument is essentially that women aren't the source of their own violence against themselves. It's men who promote that sort of position, so men need to be a part of the solution. Ending homophobia, and associated violence, and developing men's studies at universities and colleges to get men more aware of what masculinity may be today and in the future. Now, members of NOMAS also assume a public voice for pro-feminist issues. Now, there's a second group in this same pro-feminist sort of genre, and this is what's known as ACT UP. ACT-UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Now, it was a grassroots movement. When we talk about grassroots, we really just mean that this was people on the street and everyday people who were taking up initiatives in this area and looking for ways to express themselves when it came to advocating for people living with HIV and AIDS. Now, it fought for the medical treatment and changes in the social attitudes towards those infected or impacted by AIDS and HIV. Recalling tactics of civil rights movements and radical feminist ACT UP groups were intentionally leaderless and democratic. Now again, you have to sort of frame this in the 60s. And part of what was the 60s was this sort of new direction of leaderlessness and democracy. That movement in these social groups was done by the collective, by all the members, not just by a leadership of a few. They drew inspiration from the women's health movement and created underground networks for self-educated healthcare providers. Now, a third group that focused predominantly on really sort of men's anti-violence groups. Now, these groups see violence against women as a men's issues, since most violence against women is enacted by men. And they reason that violence against women is not just a woman's issue, as a majority of the violence against women is enacted by men. Therefore, prevention of violence is a men's issue. Now, some of these you will be familiar with because they are, well, the first one we're going to look at, the White Ribbon Campaign, is a Canadian initiative. Now, the White Ribbon Campaign, or WRC, is an international organization founded in Canada in 1991. Men committed to ending men committed to ending violence against women, and is the largest men's anti-violence group in the world. Members wear white ribbons between November 25th and December 6th as a symbol of their opposition to violence against women. The WRC members present workshops within their community that demonstrate violence, including physical violence, emotional violence, and sexual violence, is generally committed by men and encourages that men attend and take responsibility for stopping it and speaking out. Now, the WRC emphasizes that they are not male bashers by acknowledging that the majority of men are not violent. Now, it's also worth noting here, did you notice the date that I indicated, 1991? Okay, that's an important feature because the book, your textbook, suggests that the Montreal Massacre occurred in 1991, December 6th. And it's important to note that the actual date of the massacre in Montreal was December 6, 1989. Now, although your textbook indicates December 6, 1991, that's the day that the Canadian government, federal government, set as a National Day of Remembrance and an action on violence against women, White Ribbon Day. So it's not the actual date of the massacre that occurred in Montreal. WRC works to support women's groups and the activism that they engage in. Now, the second group we'll look at, again, you've probably seen this. It's done in Owen Sound, it's done in Barrie, it's done around the world, or not so much around the world, certainly done around North America. It's Walk a Mile in Her Shoes. And it was formed in California in 2001 and focuses on men and to encourage men to get involved in work for anti-violence. This group organizes events where men wear high heels and march through local streets. First you walk the walk is the slogan, then you can talk the talk. And you've probably either been a part of some of these or you've seen them or read about them occurring in your neighborhood. Now, some critics of the White Ribbon Campaign and the Walk a Mile in Their Shoes argue that it does not go far enough in its analysis of men's violence. The problem is not a few violent men. These critics argue by the way in which men and masculinity is defined and formed in our contemporary societies. So this is running more emphasis, if you will, or reminding us of the social construct of gender. That it's how our society defines masculinity that for some groups is what defines men's role in anti-violence, is that we have to redefine masculinity. Now, another group, a third group in this anti-violence group is Mentors in Violence Prevention, MVP. And it's an educational program founded by Jackson Katz that seeks to teach men about the ways in which aggression and violence are closely linked to cultural views of masculinity and are routine parts of their socialization. MVP focuses on the role of normative masculinity and the ways in which violence is seen as as a normal part of manhood in our society. Men are influenced by other men, so the MVP program instills anti-violence attitudes in men who then teach male peers not to be violent. The program has two foci. The first is to teach men that aggression and violence are closely linked to cultural views of masculinity, and second is to call attention to the role of bystander in preventing violence. Now that's an important role because the concept of bystander role has been studied in psychology quite a bit. The bystander behavior refers to how those who are aware of violence and how they respond to it. MVP states that men must take a personal responsibility to stop violence by both MVP states that men must take personal responsibility to stop violence by both not committing it and by refusing to condone it or allow other men's violence. So what's important here is the bystander syndrome, as it's known in psychology, is about if I witness violence against a woman and do nothing, I'm condoning it. But to step up and act as a support to the victim or to stop the male is to be that to act on a bystander behavior. Now, a number of men's groups embrace cultural ideology that men and women are fundamentally different and should have different roles and different rights. That's a different grouping or catalog of groups. These groups are called Masculinists, and they assert men suffer from discrimination and need to reclaim their rightful status as men. They also tend to ignore or denounce gay men. They don't seem to count them among needing support. We'll now consider a few of these Masculinists' men's groups. The first we'll look at are men's rights activists. The goal is to restore traditional roles of men and women and enjoy the privileges men have historically enjoyed. Now, one of the more extreme men's rights groups is what's known as free men. This group aims to restore men's pride in being real men. For them, the primary burden of masculinity is the provider role. Being the provider, that is their view of what the provider is, men in families, that when they have that role, that inhibits their masculinity. They want to regain the rightful place as heads of the family, but the status should not be tied that to a breadwinner role, that in order for me to be the head of the family, I must be the breadwinner. They want to be the head of the family irregardless. And so that's a particularly stronger and a different view of masculinity than the previous groups. And that's kind of the way it goes for both men's and women's groups. You'll find there's this dichotomous division. Now, men's rights groups think that discrimination against men is a greater problem than discrimination against women. They point to the military draft, it's predominantly men, the shorter lifespans of men, the more health problems for men, and child custody laws that don't favor men as being some of their main primary areas of attention. Now, the second sort of group is known as men's rights groups that state that the courts discriminate against men by assuming that women should be the primary parents. The most high-profile fathers' rights groups is known as Fathers for Justice, and that's with the number 4 between fathers and justice, which works to initiate public dialogue around fathers' rights. They sometimes perform dramatic stunts to draw attention to the issue. Many class action suits have been filed in the United States arguing that fathers have a constitutional right to be a parent and are thus guaranteed at least 50% shared custody. Some social issues that complicate custody issues are fathers who are not legally required child support payments and fathers who do not connect with their children after divorce. Part of the issue or the challenge with the issue is that some of these divisions of responsibilities in the court are not as black and white and as overly simplified as you should have 50% shared custody. Well, neither parent ought to have custody if there's violence towards the children perpetrated by one parent or the other. That doesn't guarantee a 50% shared custody. And so there are issues that are more gray in these movements, both men and women, but they are active and they are in society and they are promoting their agendas. The third group in this anti-feminist perspective is what's known as the Mythopoetic men. Now, this is an odd sort of a group in that it's one that was based on an author who wrote a book. It was founded by Robert Bly and has aims to foster men's personal growth by rediscovering the deep mythic roots of masculinity, masculine thinking and feeling to restore spiritual, emotional, and intellectual wholeness. The ideal masculine role existed during the ancient times in the Middle Ages when men were self-confident, strong, emotionally alive, and sensitive. So this ideal masculine role and men's connection to the work and to the earth were disrupted during the Industrial Revolution and modernization and feminism. So when men began working outside the home, young boys lost fathers who could initiate them into the manhood and teach them how to relate spiritually and emotionally to other men. The term, and this is a term by Bly, the author, father hunger is Bly's term to describe the grief experienced by modern men born from the yearning to be close with with their fathers and other men. This sort of bonding that they say is missing and is probably a root cause for where men are at today. The movement has received praise for identifying and highlighting the anguish men may feel because of a distant relationship with their fathers, but has been criticized for being unwilling to confront issues of gender inequality and for their participation in sustaining that inequity. Now, although popular during the 1980s through to the 1990s, this movement was largely been declining, and only a few active groups and a few new members are only occurring in more today's perspective. Now we get into a fourth group known as Promise Keepers, and this was founded by Bill McCartney and Dave Wardle, and it's based on an evangelical Christianity, and they preach that men should become leaders of their family because it reflects God's view of the proper relationship between husbands and wives. Men make promises to be good husbands, fathers, and members of the community, and this is to build strong families and strong communities. Now, it's based on Christian initiatives and imperatives. Men are required to be good husbands, fathers, and members of the community. The movement urges men to be leaders of their families to reflect the God-given division of labor between men and women. Promise Keepers urge men to rely on other men instead of women, believing that men can hold each other accountable in ways that women can't. Now, Promise Keepers have been criticized for their exclusion of women from their meetings and their rejection of homosexual men. Now, they've also been charged with elitism based on the membership that's mostly consisted of white, middle, and upper class men. Now, in response, the movement has attempted to recruit men from a more racially diverse membership and has elected an African American president. This also has softened their rhetoric about husbands leading wives. So currently the movement has experienced a steep decline in membership, but is trying to reinvigorate itself through international expansion. Now, a fifth group we can refer to is the Million More movement, and it was founded by Louis Farrakhan and the Reverend Benjamin Chavez Jr., aiming at and to bring back more black men to the pledge to themselves and to the spiritual transformation and political action. The Million Man March was the first held in 1995, and it's been an annual gathering since. Now, faced with criticism for encouraging black men to focus on the race of those who suffer rather than the race against inequality, no matter who the victim is, it's also criticized for being anti-feminist and anti-gay. Now, the Million More movement has learned from its criticisms of millions marches, and it's defined as an ongoing movement rather than an annual event. Includes all sexes, races, and sexualities. So as you can see, many of these movements don't stay static in their origins, but will start to move according to where they start to see they can have impact and where they need to adjust according to the times. Now, an event called Justice or Elise Rally saw Louis Farrakhan passing the torch to the new generation, in which has been galvanized by the Black Lives Matter hashtag, and notes for his radical intersectionality. This demonstrates the fluidity of activism surrounding race, gender, and sexual orientation, that it's not static. It does have a fluidity. The last little section we'll go through are what are known as more contemporary men's movements. The U.S. recession in 2008, and it certainly had an effect in Canada, hit sectors in the manufacturing and construction the hardest. The economic downturn is one of the 3 recent and large social changes that have fueled contemporary masculinists' movements. The second is that the U.S. family laws have not kept pace with the changing family dynamics. So the internet has made it possible for masculinist men to connect with one another. Younger men are redefining masculinity beyond the traditional breadwinner role. In 2012, for the first time in American history, more 18 to 34-year-old women, more than men, were saying that succeeding in a high-paying career was the number one most important thing in life. And that's a huge shift in American society, but it's reflected in Canadian society as well. When you look at the number of graduating students from post-secondary, it's largely female or women to men. Now, the Good Men Project is something that's it's contemporary. We'll start there. It serves to start a national conversation about what it means to be a good man today. The organization's publications allow men to express themselves without fear of judgment. However, many women also read the magazine in hopes to better understand men's lives. Reading another man's story and thoughts can help each man formulate his own definition of what it means to be good. In 2010, the online magazine was created featuring stories and columns that addressed issues that surfaced in men's lives: sex and relationships, sports, dads and advice, and it facilitated an ongoing conversation about what masculinity does and what it might mean. A third of the readers of the Good Man Project magazine are women who want to understand men's perspectives. So what I've really just done is a relatively quick overview of men's groups over time. And so I just want to be able to say, there isn't any one right or wrong direction. These are a collection of some samples of the more significant groups that exists. The women's movement that we're going to look at next week might be longer and in some cases richer, but the issues affecting women, certainly by the first wave, were just as simple as being seen as a person. That has not been an issue for men. And so a lot of their issues have emerged later, in part because of a dynamic and fluid societal view of what it is to be masculine and what it is to be feminine. All right, here we go. Next week, women's groups. Bye now.